Chapter 1. The Actress and the Unseen Whisper. It was on a brisk October morning in 1891 that I found myself once again ensconced in the comforting warmth of our lodgings at 221B Baker Street. The hearth glowed with a gentle fire, and the gray light filtering through the foggy window panes lent the room a tranquil, introspective air. Sherlock Holmes stood before the fireplace, his long fingers steepled, eyes half-lidded in thought, and the familiar scent of pipe tobacco lingering in the room. Strange. "Watson," he murmured suddenly, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. The human voice so expressive, yet so easily forged. I have often wondered if sound, more than sight, lends itself better to illusion. I lowered my teacup. Another philosophical musing to preface a case. Holmes's lips twitched. "As it happens, yes. Mrs. Hudson has just informed me that a certain Miss Sybil Hargrave awaits us downstairs. A rising starlet of the theater, if her name is to be believed. She claims to have heard a voice, one that no one else has." Holmes turned then, fixing me with that familiar, sharp gaze that meant the game was afoot. Within moments, the client was shown in a young woman of exceptional poise and delicate bearing. She wore a dark velvet cloak that swept the floor behind her and clutched it close, though the room was far from cold. Her eyes, large and expressive, darted between Holmes and me with a hint of anxiety. "I am grateful for your time, Mr. Holmes," she began. "Forgive the early hour, but I fear I may be going mad." "Not at all," Holmes said briskly. "Sanity, Miss Hargrave, is far more common among those who fear its absence than among those who boast of possessing it. Please, sit down and explain what troubles you." She obeyed, perching on the edge of the settee as though unsure she deserved its comfort. "I'm an actress with the Lyceum Theater," she said. "Nothing grand secondary roles, mostly. But for the past 2 months, I have been staying in a rented lodging in Bloomsbury. It is quiet and clean, ideal for learning my lines. Or it was, until I started hearing it." "It?" Holmes prompted. "The voice," she said, her fingers tightening on the velvet of her cloak. "Late at night, when the building is quiet, I hear someone speaking from behind the curtain in my bedroom. A man's voice low, whispering, saying my name. But when I pull the curtain back, there is no one there. A hallucination, perhaps." I ventured gently. She shook her head firmly. I thought so too. I told myself it must be the wind, or my imagination. But it happened again. And again. "And last night," her voice faltered. "Last night the voice said, 'You are not who you pretend to be, Sybil.' I know what you've done." Holmes leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "What have you done, Miss Hargrave?" She looked away. Nothing to warrant this." Holmes paused, then rose and crossed to his desk, where he consulted a well-worn directory. "Your lodging, precisely where is it?" "Number 17, Wexham Street, the top floor. And who else resides there?" "A landlady, Mrs. Pettigrew. A woman in her 60s. She's nearly deaf. There's also a gentleman on the floor below a Mr. Yates, a writer, I think, but I've scarcely seen him." Holmes snapped the book shut. "And this voice, has anyone else heard it?" "No. I've tried knocking on the walls, listening at the floorboards, even setting traps, but nothing. It always comes from behind the velvet curtain that covers the rear alcove in my room." Holmes turned to me. "Watson, I believe we shall take a walk to Bloomsbury." Miss Hargrave blinked. "You mean now?" "There is no better time then." "The present when the present is haunted," Holmes replied with a faint smile. The fog clung low to the cobbled streets as we made our way through Bloomsbury, with Miss Hargrave leading the way, her dark cloak trailing behind her like a shadow dot. Number 17. Wexham Street was a narrow, 4-story Georgian house squeezed between 2 taller buildings. A brass nameplate marked Pettigrew's Lodgings had dulled with age. The landlady, when summoned, proved as deaf as claimed, nodding absently as Miss Hargrave explained we would be retrieving a forgotten item. The top floor room was neat and tastefully furnished. It bore the modest elegance of someone with artistic aspirations, but little excess income. A narrow window faced the back alley. The velvet curtain hung across the far corner, concealing a shallow alcove used for costumes and storage. Holmes stood before the curtain, unmoving, his eyes scanning the fabric. Then, to my surprise, he reached up and rapped twice upon the curtain rod. Nothing. He turned to Sybil. Have you ever left the curtain drawn? She hesitated. Not at night. It unsettles me. Holmes nodded. Might I see what lies behind it? She stepped back. Holmes pulled the curtain aside, revealing a simple recess in the wall. A few dresses hanging on a rack, a half-open trunk, and an empty hat stand. But Holmes did not look at the objects. He focused instead on the wall behind them. He knelt, tapping lightly, and then he smiled. There's a hollow cavity here. Perhaps a shaft or disused chimney. It may serve as a conduit for sound. I bent down beside him. Then someone could be speaking from another floor through this wall. Possible, Holmes said, but not likely. Not without a deliberate mechanism. He stood, brushing dust from his coat. Tell me, Miss Hargrave, what do you know of Mr. Yates, the gentleman below? She frowned. Very little. He's solitary. Occasionally I smell tobacco or hear typing. Have you ever spoken to him? Only once, when he asked me if I believed in ghosts. Back on the street, Holmes was in high spirits. A voice behind a velvet curtain, Watson. It's the stuff of Gothic novels. But the question remains, why? Target Sybil Hargrave? Why the message? I know what you've done. She says she's innocent, which of course we must assume is a partial truth. Or at least her truth. We paused near a row of bookshops. Holmes glanced up at the surrounding buildings. Secrecy demands motive, Watson. And motive often springs from the past. I suspect Miss Hargrave's history will prove more complex than her stage roles suggest. I frowned. So you believe she's being watched? Threatened? Holmes tapped his cane on the pavement. I believe someone wishes her to believe that she is. As the fog closed in and gaslights flickered to life, I felt the unmistakable prickle of unease between my shoulders. A voice in the night, a hidden message, and a velvet curtain that concealed more than clothing. Somewhere in that quiet Bloomsbury house, an unseen observer was playing a game whose rules only Sherlock Holmes would decipher. Chapter 2. The Woman in Lilac and the Locked Parlor. It was early afternoon when Holmes and I arrived at Cranley House, a red brick Georgian manor tucked behind high ivy-clad walls. Its windows shuttered against the sharp breeze that swept through the quiet Chelsea Square. The atmosphere was heavy with unease, and not merely from the low-hanging mist rolling in from the Thames. A discreet police presence lingered outside the gates, and two constables nodded solemnly as we passed. We were met at the threshold by Inspector Lestrade, his expression taut with irritation and fatigue. The dim light from the hallway gas lamps gave his features a prematurely aged appearance. Holmes, Doctor, he greeted us curtly. You're a touch late. Time, Lestrade, is relative to urgency, Holmes replied airily, stepping past him. You said it was an unusual case. I trust you haven't resolved it in the last 20 minutes? Lestrade sniffed. Wouldn't dream of robbing you of the pleasure. The hallway opened into a high-ceilinged drawing room, richly furnished in mahogany and burgundy velvet. A sharp scent of camphor and something sweeter like gardenias wilting in a closed room lingered in the air. The housekeeper, a gaunt woman in a stiff black dress, stood near the hearth wringing her hands. Holmes gave her a cursory glance, before turning his full attention to the two figures seated on the chaise, a middle-aged man with a hawkish profile, and a young woman dressed in lilac silk, her eyes reddened as if from hours of weeping. Her gloves were still on her hands, an old-fashioned custom, or perhaps a sign she felt this was no longer her home. Mr. Llewellyn? Holmes asked, addressing the man. Yes, the gentleman replied stiffly, rising to his feet. Colonel Roger Llewellyn, retired. This is Miss Margaret Elston, my late wife's niece. Holmes gave a polite bow, while I noted how the girl avoided our eyes. Grief, certainly, but there was something else in alertness. Perhaps even fear tightly reined behind her otherwise delicate features. "The body is still in the parlor," Lestrade said, gesturing toward a closed door down the hall. "As you asked." "Excellent," Holmes said briskly. "But first a few words with Miss Elston." Margaret looked up, startled. "Me? I've already told. Inspector Lestrade. And you shall tell us too," Holmes said gently, lowering himself into the wingback opposite her. "Tell me about your aunt. Was she in good spirits lately?" She hesitated. Aunt Celestin was private. Since my uncle died, she rarely entertained, though she remained fond of music and often held little concerts here, strictly among acquaintances. Would she have considered herself in danger? Margaret blinked. Danger? No, not in the least. Yet she was murdered, Holmes said, eyes narrowing. Shot through the heart, behind a locked parlor door, with no weapon found. What sort of enemies might she have had? Colonel Llewellyn interjected brusquely. "If you ask me, the woman had too much time on her hands and too much money. There were always parasites about young men who flattered her with their poetry or music. She was a widow of means, and susceptible." "Colonel," Holmes said coolly, "your candor is appreciated. But you mentioned music. Did she play herself?" "She sang," Margaret answered, more softly. "She had a remarkable voice, even in age, but in recent weeks, she'd stopped. Said something had disturbed her, though she never explained what." Holmes leaned forward. "Do you recall when that change occurred?" She frowned. "Yes. It was shortly after one of her guests gave her a recording, an odd wax cylinder, I think. She said it had an unsettling resonance. She never listened to it a second time." Holmes's fingers steepled. "Did you hear it?" She shook her head. "Only a few seconds. It was indistinct. A voice, perhaps. Muffled and distant, like someone whispering behind thick velvet." Lestrade snorted. "Sounds like nonsense." "On the contrary," Holmes murmured. "It sounds like a thread." We moved to the parlor where Lady Celestin Eelston had been found. The room was dark and cool, the fireplace unlit. Her body remained seated. At the pianoforte, head tilted unnaturally to the side, eyes closed as if in slumber. A single gunshot wound marked her chest, precise and bloodless, given the lack of surrounding splatter. The revolver was nowhere to be seen. "Locked from the inside," Lestrade said grimly. "Key still in the door when we forced it." "Any open windows?" "None. The sashes stiff hadn't been raised in weeks, by the look of it." Holmes circled the room slowly, every footstep measured. He paused beside the pianoforte and gently lifted the lid. A few notes chimed out flat and eerily discordant. "Doctor," Holmes called over. "Observe the expression on her face. Not fear. Something subtler, surprise perhaps." I bent over the corpse, then nodded. Yes, not terror. But something startled her, and her hand still resting on the keys. Holmes stooped and studied the instrument's pedals and hinges, before moving to a velvet curtain that hung across a recessed alcove. He reached behind it and withdrew. Nothing, but his gaze sharpened. Interesting. There's a faint indentation in the carpet behind this curtain, a narrow one, roughly the shape of a gramophone stand, yet no such device is here. Lestrade raised an eyebrow. "You think someone was hiding there?" "No," Holmes said quietly. "I think the gramophone was." He glanced at Margaret and Llewellyn, who had followed us in. "Colonel, you mentioned poetry and music. Did any of Lady Celestin's acquaintances, particularly gentlemen, provide recordings for her?" Llewellyn sighed. "Too many to count." "Some. Composer fellow gave her one a month ago. Claude Vale, I believe. Do you know where this Mr. Vale might be found?" "Last I heard, he lived near Bloomsbury. She once visited his studio, some ramshackle garret in Red Lion Square." Holmes gave a small smile. Then we shall pay him a visit. And the cylinder? I asked. Ah yes, Holmes said, eyes gleaming. If it was played before the moment of her death, it may still be here, but not in plain sight. No thief would risk carrying it away, and no murderer would leave such a clue, unless they thought it too obscure to matter. He turned to Lestrade. Have your men searched for a gramophone cylinder, possibly, hidden inside the piano fort, behind the curtain recess, or in any hollowed compartments. And when you find it, do not play it. Lestrade raised a brow. Why not? Because Lady Celestin heard something in it that frightened her enough to stop singing forever, Holmes said, his voice low. And because whatever voice lies behind that velvet curtain may yet whisper again. Chapter 3. A scent of paint and perfume when Holmes and I arrived at number 6, Morley Crescent. The sun had begun to retreat behind the smog-streaked rooftops of North London. The neighborhood bore that curious blend of neglect and pretension red-bricked homes, adorned with once fashionable embellishments, their iron gates rusting, hedgerows untrimmed, and lace curtains yellowed with age. We were greeted at the front door by a tall, wiry woman in her 60s with silvered hair drawn into a severe bun. She was clad in dark gray serge and wore the expression of one who had long been disappointed by life. I take it you are Mr. Holmes, she said in a voice that betrayed both caution and quiet resentment. Holmes bowed faintly. And this is my associate, Dr. Watson. You must be Mrs. Addlethorpe. Indeed, she said. Though I go by Miss, I never married. If you'll step inside, though I must say, I don't see what good will come of stirring up shadows. My cousin's death was tragic, yes, but not mysterious. Nevertheless, Holmes said evenly, a man has been charged, and he pleads innocence. The law does not take kindly to unresolved uncertainties, nor do I. She pursed her lips, but led us into the hallway, a narrow corridor lined with dark floral wallpaper and oil paintings of stern ancestors. The house smelled faintly of must and beeswax. Holmes's gaze flitted across each surface with the veracity of a hawk surveying a treetop. He was staying in the guest room first door on the left, she said as we reached the staircase. And the rest of the household? Holmes asked, as he ascended the steps. Just me, the maid Elsie, and Mr. Denbury Morris Denbury. He rents the upper flat. Been here 3 years. Keeps to himself mostly. My cousin, Mr. Barraclough, came only the day before his death. I hadn't seen him in years. He wired me out of the blue. Holmes raised a brow. Do you still have the telegram? I burnt it, she said, her mouth tight. Pity, Holmes murmured. The guest room was modest and tidy. A single bed, a small writing desk, a valise in the corner, and a dressing screen near the window. Everything was untouched, save for the absence of the police chalk outline, a practice Holmes always found unnecessarily theatrical. Holmes immediately turned his attention to the writing desk. He ran his fingers gently over the wood, opening drawers and inspecting their contents. Has anyone entered this room since the constables left? No one. I locked it myself, Miss Addlethorpe said. May I see the key? She handed it over. Holmes examined the ridges and returned it without a word. Then he moved to the window and leaned out, peering into the alley below. It overlooked a walled garden, choked with ivy and wild thistle, leading to the back gate. There's a strong chemical smell, I remarked, nose wrinkling. Turpentine? Possibly, Holmes said. But there's something else subtler. He crouched near the floorboards under the dressing screen, took out a small vial from his coat, and dabbed a cloth with it. Yes, he said quietly. An artist's medium mixed with lavender oil. And something far more expensive, I blinked. Perfume? Holmes nodded. And a very exclusive blend at that, Enique de Soie. Only sold at Fournier's in Bond Street. My knowledge of such things is rudimentary, but I recall an old client being obsessed with it. Do you suppose a woman was here? Perhaps. He stood and moved to the small table near the bed. which held a worn copy of the Pickwick Papers and a silver-rimmed pince-nez. Holmes examined the lenses, then set them down carefully. The glasses are not Barraclough's. His eyesight was reportedly excellent. You think they belong to a visitor? I think, Holmes said, eyes glinting, that someone wanted us to believe they belonged to a visitor. It's all too neatly placed, as if someone staged it. Miss Addlethorpe appeared uneasy. Mr. Holmes, if you're suggesting some sort of play acting, I'm not suggesting, Holmes said gently. I'm observing. Now, might we speak with the maid? Miss Addlethorpe nodded tersely and summoned Elsie, a freckled girl of perhaps 20, with straw-colored hair and an expression of open worry. I told the police everything, she said nervously. I brought up his tea at 6:30. As usual, found him slumped over the desk. I dropped the tray and screamed. Was the room locked? Holmes asked. No, sir. Door was closed but not locked. That's what made me think something was wrong. He always locked it when he wasn't expecting me. Holmes tilted his head. And yet, he did not lock it that evening? She shook her head. Did you notice anything odd? A smell, a sound perhaps? I did think I heard someone leave the house around that time. Not by the front. Mind you, I was sitting near the parlor and the doorbell didn't ring. I heard the back latch click. And you told the police this? She glanced nervously at Miss Addlethorpe. I did, sir. But they said it was probably Mr. Denbury, only it didn't sound like him. Holmes narrowed his eyes. What does Mr. Denbury sound like? He limped slightly, Elsie said, from his war wound. This person moved too quickly. Very observant, Holmes. Saw it approvingly. Did you see the visitor? No, sir. Just heard the latch. Holmes turned to Miss Addlethorpe. Might we speak to Mr. Denbury? I'm sure he's in, she said, already beginning to look exasperated. We climbed to the upper floor, where Holmes knocked sharply on the door. After a pause, it opened to reveal a man in his early 40s with neat, chestnut hair and pince-nez identical to the pair found in the guest room. He leaned slightly on a cane. Mr. Denbury? Holmes asked. Yes? I am Sherlock Holmes. And this is Dr. Watson. We are investigating the death of Mr. Barraclough. Denbury's eyes flickered. I see. I'd assumed the matter was closed. Holmes studied him. Why? Because Inspector Lestrade said as much, Denbury replied coolly. He believed it a straightforward poisoning. Yet you must know, Holmes said mildly, that poison is never straightforward. Denbury's lips twitched. What? Is it you want to ask me, Mr. Holmes? Where were you at the hour of 6:30 on the evening in question? In my flat, Denbury replied. Reading. He gestured behind him. I was reading the Moonstone. Rather fitting, don't you think? Did you hear or see anything unusual? No, I keep to myself. Holmes glanced around the flat. A canvas easel stood near the window, with a half-finished painting of a woman behind a gauzy curtain. The face, however, was unfinished, sketched faintly in charcoal, but without features. You're an artist? Amateur. Denbury said, helps with the nerves. Holmes stepped forward and examined the palette. Lavender oil. Yes, it masks the stronger smells. Is this your pince-nez? Holmes asked, holding up the pair from the guest room. Denbury blinked. No, I lost mine last week. Those look similar. Curious, Holmes said lightly. I should very much like to borrow this canvas. Denbury looked startled. It's incomplete. All the more reason, Holmes replied with a smile. Come, Watson. As we descended the stairs, I asked, do you suspect Denbury? Holmes shook his head. No, he's too careful. But the canvas, the curtain. I believe he has seen the figure we seek, perhaps even unknowingly. And the painting? Art, Holmes said quietly, often captures what the conscious mind overlooks. Chapter 4. A cry in the fog. The early afternoon saw a gray haze descend over London like a theater curtain being drawn before the second act. Our hansom cab rattled through mist-shrouded lanes, the rhythmic clatter of hooves softened by the damp air. Holmes sat beside me, his long fingers steepled, eyes closed but mind alert. I could see the sharp rise and fall of his breath. Always more concentrated when he approached what he termed the true axis of a case. We were en route to the Orpheus Hall, an aging theatrical venue near Soho. According to Mrs. Cumberley's private letter, her late husband had been rehearsing a new opera there, Eurydice's Lament, in the days before his untimely demise. Holmes insisted we begin there. As the fog thickened, Holmes murmured without opening his eyes, "There's something unnaturally tidy about the widow's testimony, Watson. You may have noticed the way she spoke about her husband's private performances." She rehearsed her words. "Surely grief might make one choose her phrasing carefully," I offered. "Grief lends chaos to speech, not polish." What she told us had the crisp finality of a well-learned line. He opened his eyes then, sharp and clear despite the gloom. A stage curtain, Watson velvet on the front, but always a tangled mess behind. Let's examine what lies behind hers. We alighted in the narrow alley behind the Orpheus Hall, its brickwork mottled and slick with years of coal smoke and rain. The stage door bore no sign, only a tarnished brass plate scratched by time and keys. Holmes knocked with 3 quick raps. A moment later, it creaked open to reveal a small, round-shouldered man with disheveled hair and the anxious air of one who had slept poorly for several nights. "You'll be Mr. Holmest?" the man asked in a thick Yorkshire accent. Holmes nodded. "And you must be Mr. Elridge, the stage manager." "Aye. Come inside before the chill gets in your bones." The backstage was a warren of corridors, ropes and props covered in muslin sheets. A thick curtain hung limp across the stage opening, and the air smelled of dust and grease paint. Elridge led us to a dressing room at the far end, where a gaslight hissed softly. "'Twas here the maestro used to practice alone," he said, pointing at a rickety upright piano. "You refer to Lord Cumberley?" I asked. Elridge nodded. "He'd come in most nights after the others left, said he needed the quiet. Not that he was ever interrupted. Nobody stayed after dusk, ever since that voice." Holmes, who had been examining the floorboards, paused. "Voice?" "The man. Swallowed. Some say it's the spirit of an old soprano what took poison backstage 50 years ago. Others say it's a trick of the wind. But there were nights, sir, when I swear I heard singing faint and high, like it came from the velvet curtain itself." "Did Lord Cumberley ever speak of hearing it?" Elridge scratched his head. "Only once. Told me I ought to check the acoustics in the North Passage. Said there was an echo he couldn't account for. I told him he might be imagining things, but he hesitated. The last night he was here, he looked white as paper. I found him hunched at the piano, hands shaking. What piece was he playing?" Holmes asked. "Something strange. I don't know music well, but weren't one of his usual compositions. Dissonant, like a lullaby from a nightmare." Holmes's fingers skimmed the keys of the dusty piano, producing a discordant cluster of notes. "You say he practiced alone. Was there ever a night he was not?" "One night," Elridge said after a pause. "A Tuesday. A woman came in around dusk, slim, wearing a blue veil. Said she had an appointment with Lord Cumberley." "Did she give a name?" Holmes asked, his tone sharpening. "No, sir. Just walked straight in like she belonged. I never saw her again." Holmes turned toward me. "You recall the letter, Watson? She's come back. It might be this woman. She could have been a student, or a colleague," I suggested. But my words felt flat in the charged air, or a shadow from the past. Holmes replied. We thanked Elridge and departed, but Holmes lingered in the wings, trailing his fingers along the velvet curtain. "Feel this, Watson. It is thick, absorbed sound. A voice behind it might seem bodiless, spectral. You think the singing voice people claim to have heard. Was quite human and quite deliberate, Holmes finished for me. But its purpose, that remains unclear. As we stepped into the alley once more, the fog had thickened into a gray wall. Somewhere distant, a carriage bell rang and was swallowed by the mist. Holmes paused, cocking his head. Did you hear that? A muffled scream pierced the silence, brief, strangled, and unmistakably female. Without a word, Holmes bolted down the alley toward the sound. I struggled to keep up as we dashed across a slit-cobbled courtyard and into a side street, flanked by rows of shuttered shops. The fog parted briefly, and we saw her. A woman stood trembling against a gas lamp, veil torn, breath ragged. She tried to take my bag. She gasped. A woman in blue. Holmes stepped forward. Where did she go? She ran toward the theater. Down there, Holmes was already running, and I followed, heart thudding. But when we reached the alley once more, it was empty. Save for swirling mist. No sign of footfall, no rustling silk, only silence. Holmes turned slowly. A woman in blue, he murmured, twice mentioned. Once before a man's death, now in an alley after a scream. The ghost in velvet may not be dead after all. He knelt and inspected the cobbles near the stage door. Here faint markings. Heels, narrow, expensive. He traced the impression with a gloved finger. And recently made. She was here. But gone now, I said. Like smoke. Holmes rose. Not smoke, Watson. A shadow. And shadows, as you well know, are cast by something solid. Chapter 5. The scent of powder and paper. The following morning broke over Baker Street with a flat and cheerless gray. The rain of the previous evening having left the streets soaked and steaming beneath the early sun. I awoke to find Holmes, already at the breakfast table, hunched over the pages of the Times, a faint frown etched between his brows. Good morning, Watson, he said without looking up. I trust you slept more soundly than our friend Mr. Travers. You think he is in danger? I think he is already caught in a web he only half perceives, Holmes replied cryptically. The threads of the velvet curtain are beginning to draw inward. Before I could question him further, Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing the Morning Post. Holmes accepted the handful of letters with disinterest, until he saw one in a thick cream envelope, the address penned in a tight, elegant hand. He slid it open swiftly with his knife and scanned the contents. I noticed his eyes sharpen, and the corner of his mouth curled in that peculiar way that always heralded an unexpected turn. Watson, he said, handing me the note. Read that aloud if you would. Mr. Holmes, I find myself watched, though by whom I cannot say. I feel eyes even behind the walls of my own home. There was a moment this morning when I thought the voice would return. It did not. But I fear it is only a matter of time. I must see you again, but not here. Meet me at noon by the statue in Lincoln's Inn Fields. Come alone. Trust no one. Yours in haste, Emmeline Travers. Holmes tapped the table thoughtfully. She is frightened more so than she showed in our sitting room. You don't believe this is merely imagination or hysteria. My dear Watson, the human mind may be imaginative, but it rarely invents footfalls behind closed doors, or voices that call from shadows, unless under some great strain. Miss Travers may be sensitive, but I do not believe she is mad. We took a cab toward Lincoln's Inn Fields just shy of the appointed hour. The city churned about us, its usual fog mingled with the smoke of early traffic. When we arrived, the statue stood in solemn watch beneath the sunless sky. A thin wind rustled the trees, and the square was sparsely populated. A few barristers, a paper boy, and a flower seller. But of Miss Travers, there was no sign. Holmes stood beside the statue, still as the bronze figure above him, eyes scanning the entrances and exits like a hawk. He checked his watch thrice in 10 minutes. She is not coming, I said finally. She has already come, Holmes murmured, and she has either been frightened away or intercepted. We were turning to leave when the flower seller approached. A small girl no older than 12, her basket half empty. "You Mr. Holmes, sir?" She piped up. Holmes crouched before her. "Indeed. Did someone give you a message for me?" She nodded and pulled a folded note from her coat. "I was followed. I believe someone close to me is not who they claim to be. Meet me instead at the reading room of the British Museum at 1 o'clock. I pray I am not being foolish. E.T." Holmes stood briskly. "Come, Watson. The game accelerates." We arrived at the British Museum a quarter past the hour. The reading room loomed with its great dome and hallowed silence, the scent of parchment and dust hanging in the air like incense. Scholars and students dotted the rows, their heads bent over books. We searched the aisles quietly. Holmes paused now and then to peer down an alcove or over a reader's shoulder. Then we saw her. Emmeline Travers sat at a desk near the far end, hunched over a stack of books, her gloved hands folded tightly before her. She looked pale, more so than the day prior, and her eyes darted nervously between the marble columns. Holmes approached without a word and slid into the seat beside her. I sat opposite. "You were followed?" he asked softly. She nodded. "Last night. I went to bed before midnight and heard a knock on the servant's door. Then nothing. This morning, my music teacher arrived too early. He claimed he had forgotten his scarf the day before, but he lingered too long, and his eyes." She trailed off. "The same teacher who was your accompanist?" Holmes asked. "Yes, Mr. Kershaw. He has been with me for 2 years. And you? Trust him?" I thought I did. But I found something odd in the music room this morning." She reached into her bag and produced a torn scrap of paper, which she passed to Holmes. It was lined with faint ink impressions, as if it had been hastily discarded. Holmes laid it on the table and examined it under his lens. "Impressions of musical notation. No, wait." He tilted the page. "This is not music at all. These are code symbols. Look here, Watson." I leaned in. There were clusters of symbols that resembled letters, but formed no recognizable pattern. Beneath them, in very faint pencil, was the word Venetia. "Does that name mean anything to you, Miss Travers?" Holmes asked. Emmeline shook her head. "No. I've never met anyone by that name." Holmes tucked the note away. "Miss Travers, I want you to return home now. Speak to no one. Leave your luggage packed, but do not run. If you are being watched, you must play your part convincingly. I will call upon you again this evening with Dr. Watson." She nodded, her lips tight. As we exited the museum, Holmes stopped on the steps and lit a cigarette. He exhaled slowly, staring out across the gray street. "What do you make of the code?" I asked. "I believe, Watson, that we are dealing with a conspiracy not merely of whispers, but of shadows. That symbol sheet was not written by a frightened woman. It was left, perhaps planted. And the name Venetia is not one chosen at random. There is a pattern forming, though still incomplete. And Mr. Kershaw? Let us say I would be very interested to know if he truly teaches piano." That evening, as Holmes promised, we returned to the Travers household in Bloomsbury. But it was not Miss Travers who answered the door. It was the housekeeper, white-faced and breathless. "She's gone," she cried. "Vanished. Her luggage, her coat, all gone." Holmes stepped past her into the foyer, his eyes darting from corner to corner. "And the music teacher?" "Gone too, sir," the woman said. "He was expected at 5. Never came." Holmes strode into the music room. A single note hung in the air, played perhaps minutes before. On the piano, another scrap of paper sat unfolded. Holmes took one. Looking grimaced, I picked it up. The voice behind the curtain is real. "You were warned." Title: Sherlock Holmes and the Voice Behind the Velvet. Curtain * chapter, The Phantom Rehearsal. It was nearly 6 o'clock when Holmes and I found ourselves once more in the dusky, velvet-clad corridors of the Merivale Theater. Mr. Draycott, the harried manager, met us at the entrance to the stage door. His expression stretched between relief and residual fear. "You've come just in time," he whispered hurriedly. "Something is dreadfully wrong again. Miss LaRoche. She refuses to sing." Holmes regarded him with that sharpened stillness he often wore when a case began to unfold in ways unseen. "Has she explained why?" he asked. Draycott cast a glance toward the dressing rooms behind him. "She says she heard the voice again. This time not during the performance, but in her dressing room. Just as she began her vocal warm-up, she claims she heard it, whispering behind the curtain. It frightened her so badly, she refuses to go on." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "And yet the performance is scheduled for tonight?" Draycott nodded miserably. "She's locked herself in and won't emerge. I've called in a replacement, a chorus girl who knows the part, but it's a pale substitute. This is a disaster." Holmes placed a calming hand on the man's shoulder. "Take heart, Mr. Draycott. We may yet prevent your theater's descent into full hysteria. Watson and I shall need access to Miss LaRoche's dressing room and the stage itself. And I would like the theater cleared. No unnecessary staff, no. Loitering actors." The manager hesitated, but nodded. Yes, of course." Within 10 minutes, Holmes and I stood before the actress's door. Its fine mahogany paint slightly chipped at the base. Holmes knocked twice, not sharply, but with an oddly gentle rhythm. A soft voice came from within. "Who is it?" "Sherlock." "Holmes," he replied. "And Dr. Watson, we mean no harm, Miss LaRoche, only clarity." A pause, then the slow creak of a lock. The door opened halfway, and Celestine LaRoche's pale face emerged, her dark hair wrapped in a silk scarf. Her eyes were wide, rimmed with sleeplessness and fear. "You heard of the voice again," Holmes said without inflection. She nodded. Slowly, "I know it sounds mad, but I heard it clearly. It whispered ... something I couldn't understand. As if speaking to someone, or no one. Describe what happened." She stepped back to allow us inside. The dressing room was spacious, its walls padded with soft crimson fabric, and its ceiling arched like a cathedral alcove. A large mirror, cluttered with cosmetics and a feathered headdress, reflected her trembling fingers. I just finished humming the scales. Then it began, from just behind the curtain by that alcove. She gestured to a corner draped in heavy green velvet. A voice, low, breathy, like someone with a throat full of fog. It whispered in a language I don't know. I froze, and then it stopped. Holmes moved to the curtain and examined it carefully. He tapped the wall behind it, solid wood. "No passage," he murmured. "No hollow void ... but perhaps something smaller." He withdrew his lens and examined the upper corner of the room. "Watson, fetch me the ladder from the stage wing." I returned moments later with a small wooden stepladder, and Holmes swiftly climbed it, inspecting the cornices above the drapery. His fingers touched something, and his eyes narrowed. "A ventilation grate," he announced. "Decorative, but hollow. Tell me, Miss LaRoche, have you ever heard voices from the dressing room next door?" She frowned. "Occasionally, yes. Sometimes laughter or arguments, but never ... whispers." Holmes removed the grate, revealing a narrow shaft leading horizontally, perhaps part of the old ventilation system. A tight space, but one that could carry sound from room to room. He examined the surface of the opening, brushing his fingertips along the dust. "Fresh marks," he muttered. "Someone has touched this recently." He replaced the grate and descended, motioning me to join him. In the hallway, "Watson," he said lowly, "someone has been utilizing the ventilation passages of this theater. Not to traverse physically, but to transmit sound, whispers, perhaps music, into this room. But what would that achieve?" I asked. "Fear," Holmes said. "Control. Miss LaRoche has become paralyzed by dread, and as we've seen, she holds a central role in the theater's success. Remove her, and you damage the production." Damaging the production damages the finances. And if the finances fail, perhaps the theater changes hands. We made our way to the stage where the replacement soprano was nervously rehearsing. Her voice, though serviceable, lacked the power of Miss LaRoche's. Holmes barely listened. He paced slowly, head tilted, as if absorbing the mood of the room. The velvet curtain lay closed, its folds vast and heavy. "Watson, the box," Holmes murmured suddenly. The upper box seat where the strange whispering was first reported. The place Lady Dunsmore claimed to have heard a voice. We climbed the red-carpeted stairs and emerged into the private viewing box. From here, one could see the entire stage and orchestra pit. Holmes moved to the corner, crouched, and examined the edge of the balustrade. Then he knelt by the wall behind the box. "A curious fixture," he noted. "Do you see this, Watson?" Embedded. Near the upper corner was a tiny hole, scarcely wider than the diameter of a pencil. Holmes extracted a fine steel probe and slipped it inside, angled downward toward the stage, and ... He tapped the adjacent paneling. "Yes, hollow. Likely leads to the old acoustical ducts that once ran beneath the building. Before modern renovations sealed them off, or so it was believed." He stood and dusted off his hands. "Someone has engineered a way to create the illusion of a voice without ever appearing on stage. A series of speaking tubes or old ducts, perhaps used long ago for stage cues or orchestral communication, revived now for darker purpose." We returned below to find Draycott waiting with increasing agitation. "Any progress, Mr. Holmes?" "A great deal," Holmes said simply. "But we are not yet ready to draw conclusions. I shall require the blueprints of the theater, including any records of past renovations." Draycott nodded eagerly. "Yes, yes. We have old architectural plans in the office vault. I'll fetch them." As he departed, Holmes turned to me. "Watson, the pieces are moving, though their final shape remains unclear. We know now that the voice is no ghost. It is a manipulation of space and sound, and likely tied to someone with knowledge of the theater's forgotten skeleton. Do you suspect the composer? Or perhaps Lermont? Too early. Lermont is a performer. His motive might be fame, but not sabotage. The composer, Aubrey Tiernan, is interesting, brilliant, reclusive, and oddly positioned to benefit from chaos. Yet the voice is not his alone. There's a puppeteer still unseen." He paused, eyes narrowing. "Tonight, Watson, we shall return. And we will not be alone. If the voice is to whisper again, let it do so under observation." And with that, Holmes strode down the velvet corridor, already laying the trap that would catch the unseen speaker in their own theater of illusions. Chapter 7. The veil of memory. The fog lay thick along the streets of Bloomsbury, curling like a living thing around the wrought iron railings and gas lamps, its fingers seeping into the fabric of coats and cloaks. As we alighted from the hansom cab outside No. 42 Litchfield Row, the modest boarding house where Miss Claudia Winterbourne resided, the air was sodden with the smell of coal smoke and something subtler still, apprehension. Holmes, ever attuned to such nuances, tilted his head slightly and inhaled. "There's something odd in the air, Watson. Not merely the soot of London's breath, but the weight of unresolved intentions. I should think your poetic phrasing masks." "Anxiety," I said, tightening the collar of my overcoat. "Not anxiety, Watson. Anticipation." The landlady, a square-shouldered woman in a starched apron, opened the door before we had time to knock. Her eyes were narrow with suspicion. "You'll be here about the girl," she said with an upward sniff. "Miss Winterbourne?" "Yes," Holmes replied evenly. "Sherlock Holmes. This is my associate, Dr. Watson. We have reason to believe Miss Winterbourne may be in danger." The landlady gave a sharp nod and stepped aside. "She's been in a state since the performance at the Mercury Theater," the woman muttered as we ascended the stairs. "Wouldn't touch her supper. I told her not to go messing about with those theater folk. It's always the quiet ones who draw the wrong sort. Holmes paused on the landing, examining a faded oil painting of a windswept moor. Have there been any visitors? Anyone unusual? No visitors. Just a letter. Arrived this morning. Didn't see the messenger. Slipped it under her door. He exchanged a glance with me. Has she mentioned the contents of the letter? No. She locked herself in soon after. I heard weeping. We knocked softly on the third door along the corridor. A moment passed, and then the sound of the lock turning met our ears. Miss Winterbourne stood pale and drawn, her auburn hair loosely pinned, her eyes reddened but sharp. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "And Dr. Watson, I wondered if you'd come." Holmes inclined his head. "May we speak inside?" She nodded and stepped aside. The room was modest neat, with a single iron bed, a writing desk, and a small bookshelf of poetry volumes and theatrical reviews. The heavy curtains were drawn, though daylight strained to seep through. Holmes's eyes scanned the room with swift precision, taking in every detail. The cracked porcelain cup on the knitstand, the faint indentation in the carpet where someone had stood recently, too long and too still to be idle. "You've received a letter," Holmes said quietly. Claudia stiffened. "Yes, may I?" She hesitated, then crossed to the desk and drew out a folded sheet from beneath a book of Tennyson's verse. She handed it to Holmes without a word dot. It was written in a fine, looping hand, no signature, no date dot, the voice that speaks behind the curtain. "And it knows you. Do not betray what you saw, or you shall hear it again closer." And final. Holmes read it aloud, slowly, each syllable ringing with cold menace. "Did you recognize the handwriting?" he asked. "No," Claudia murmured. "But I knew what it meant." She lowered herself onto the bed, visibly trembling. "That night, I went back to the theater after the curtain call. I had left my shawl behind, and the doorman allowed me in through the side entrance. The stage was empty, and most had gone. But I heard something, a voice, from behind the velvet curtain at the back of the stage. It was speaking, but no one was there." Holmes leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with intense concentration. "What did it say?" "I don't remember clearly. Something about disgrace and removal, a threat. But it wasn't addressed to me. It sounded like part of a conversation, and the voice was strangely modulated, like an actor in disguise." Holmes sat in silence, absorbing her words. "And then I crept closer, just beyond the footlights. I peeked behind the curtain, but there was no one there. Only shadows, and the whisper stopped as soon as I looked." "You mentioned the voice was familiar," I said gently. She hesitated. "It sounded a little like Mr. Dunstable, but not entirely. It was as though someone was imitating him or mocking him." "The illusion of identity," Holmes mused, tapping the letter. "And now someone wishes to ensure your silence." Claudia nodded, pressing a hand to her lips. "I thought perhaps I imagined it, until this arrived." "Miss Winterbourne," Holmes said, rising to his feet, "you must not remain here tonight." Her eyes widened. "You think they'll come for me?" "I think whoever left this message already has," he said calmly. "There was someone standing at your door this morning, for quite some time." She looked stricken. "I shall make arrangements." Holmes continued. "You'll stay under Mrs. Hudson's care at Baker Street. Watson and I will return to the theater. But it's closed today." "That," Holmes said, drawing on his gloves, "is precisely why we must go. The Mercury Theater, dark and silent in the afternoon mist, stood like a sleeping beast. Holmes bribed the stagehand at the side entrance, a young man with soot-streaked hands, and a nervous twitch with a sovereign and a promise of discretion. We entered the cavernous hall through the side stage, stepping past hanging ropes and painted flats into the shadowed wings. The silence was eerie, broken only by the occasional creak of the wooden rigging above. Holmes moved with feline grace across the stage, pausing at the thick burgundy velvet curtain that hung across the rear. This is where she heard the voice, I said, lowering my voice instinctively. He nodded, then suddenly lifted a hand. "Do. You hear that?" I strained to listen. There it was, a faint rustling behind the curtain. Holmes stepped forward, and in one swift motion, drew it back, but there was no one there. Only a narrow wooden passage running behind the curtain, unlit, lined with aging props and discarded costume pieces. Holmes drew a match and lit a small lantern from the wall sconce. "Follow me closely, Watson." The passage wound narrowly behind the stage, running the width of the theater. As we moved forward, Holmes stopped at a peculiar notch in the floorboards. He knelt, lifting a loose panel. Beneath it, a cramped wooden compartment containing a coiled wire and what appeared to be a voice projection tube cleverly hidden. "Speaking tube," Holmes whispered. "Connected to somewhere backstage or perhaps even outside." He examined the coiled wire. "This is rubber-insulated modern. Someone has constructed a private means of broadcasting their voice to the theater floor, a phantom speaker behind the curtain." "Which explains Miss Winterbourne's experience," I said. "She heard a disembodied voice, but the speaker was never there." "Quite so," Holmes replied. "And the voice was chosen carefully, mimicking Dunstable perhaps, or someone else whose influence could frighten." He replaced the panel and stood. "But why frighten her?" I asked. Holmes straightened. "Because she knows, or might soon deduce, something vital. Someone wanted her frightened into silence, and when that failed, they sent a message." We emerged into the dressing room corridor. Holmes examined each door, then stopped abruptly at one with a small placard that read, "Lil Moreau." "Miss Lydia Moreau," I said. "The soprano from the performance," Holmes nodded. "She was present the night of the whisper, and she hasn't been seen since." He tried the handle, locked from his coat pocket. Holmes withdrew a slender skeleton key and deftly turned the lock. Inside was a perfume-laced dressing room, ornate, powdered, and slightly disheveled. A cracked mirror, a silk glove on the chair, and upon the vanity, a photograph. Holmes lifted it, examining the image. Lydia Moreau arm in arm with Charles Dunstable, smiling, but with strained eyes. Beneath it was an envelope, unsealed. He removed the folded page and read aloud. "My voice is no longer mine. The phantom has taken it. I shall sing no more, not until the theater is free of its shadow. If you find this, know that I tried to warn you." There was no signature, only the faint trace of perfume and fear. Holmes turned slowly toward me, his expression unreadable. "It appears," he said, "that Miss Moreau has vanished, but not before encountering our ghost." "And what now, Holmes?" He looked toward the stage. "Now we listen. Not for what is said aloud, but for what is being whispered." Chapter 8. A pale envelope and a bitter truth. The chill in the air grew more pronounced as Holmes and I stepped once more into the alley behind the Darnley Theater. It had rained earlier, and the cobbles were slick, reflecting the dull lamplight as though mourning some unseen tragedy. The scent of damp ash and brick lingered, punctuated by the occasional whiff of grease paint wafting from the theater's side entrance. We had returned that evening under a veil of anonymity, Holmes with his collar turned up in a black scarf, tucked high over his chin, his deerstalker abandoned for a more commonplace flat cap. "I've always found," Holmes murmured as he stepped gingerly over a puddle, "that murder, when properly executed, is rarely flashy. It's not the drama, Watson, that holds the key, but the minutiae." "You think this is a murder, then?" I asked, still uncertain. "Not an accident, nor illness?" He glanced at me. "Did you not hear the same chilling vocal tremor in Miss Burnell's account as I did? She is no fool. And when an experienced stage actress admits to being genuinely frightened, Watson, it's best not to dismiss it lightly." We rounded the corner of the building, and Holmes paused at the spot where the stagehand's body had been found. The police had done their duty in carting away the corpse, but little else. The cobblestones had dried, though one could still discern the darker shadow where blood had pooled. Holmes crouched beside it. "Did you notice, Watson?" he said softly, brushing a finger across the edge of the stones, that the body was lying face up, yet the bruising was mostly at the back of the skull? "I did not." "Precisely. That in itself is telling. Either he fell backwards and someone turned him over, or someone wished to give the impression he had fallen when in truth he had been struck." Holmes rose, brushing off his knees, and began scanning the alley's perimeter. A rusty fire escape clung to the side of the building like a brittle spider's web. A single frayed rope hung from above, swinging slightly in the breeze. Holmes eyed it with narrowed focus. "What are you thinking?" I asked. "I'm wondering, Watson, how easy it would be to drop a weighted object from above, just enough to render a man unconscious and make it appear an accident in the dark." He made a quick note in his pocketbook and motioned for us to leave. Back in our rooms at Baker Street, the fire was crackling when Mrs. Hudson knocked on the door. She entered with a small silver tray upon which sat a single white envelope. "This came by hand, Mr. Holmes," she said, her tone hesitant. "A lad no older than 14, said it was urgent." Holmes thanked her, and she left with a glance over her shoulder, worry pinching the corners of her eyes. Holmes held the envelope to the firelight. No postmark, no return name, he muttered. He slid it open with a silver letter opener and unfolded the single sheet of heavy cream paper inside dot as he read. His brow furrowed. Then, to my surprise, he handed it to me without comment. "Mr. Holmes, you are meddling where you are not wanted. There are voices that should remain hidden. Step back before the curtain falls on you." There was no signature. "A threat," I said. "Blatant and cowardly." Holmes only nodded, his eyes distant. "But also desperate. Someone is watching. They fear discovery. And they sent this to throw me off the scent. It means we are close, Watson, very close indeed." The next morning brought with it a shift in the atmosphere. Holmes, ever the creature of odd habits, spent a full hour perched on the sofa, tuning his violin while staring at the coals in the grate. I dared not interrupt him, knowing this was a sign his mind was deeply engaged. Finally, he rose. "We return to the theater, Watson. I wish to speak to Miss Carmichael once more." We arrived to find the theater surprisingly subdued. Miss Carmichael met us in the now empty costume room, where mannequins loomed like silent sentinels in half-lit corners. "You've heard about Edmund?" she asked, her voice low. "It's terrible. He was only 26. "We have," Holmes replied gently. "Miss Carmichael, do you recall if anything unusual happened during the final rehearsal last week before the accident?" She hesitated. "There was one thing. Miss Burnell came in late, said she'd been locked out of her dressing room, but the key was always hanging on the hook backstage. I remember she was flustered. And then later, during the rehearsal, there was this awful moment where she screamed out of turn. Said she'd heard someone whispering behind the velvet curtain." Holmes's interest visibly sharpened. "Which curtain?" "The side stage one, right before the trapdoor stairs. We all laughed about it then, but now," Holmes nodded solemnly, "now you're wondering if it was someone hiding." She nodded. "Or something worse." That evening, Holmes requested the full building plans of the Darnley Theater. Thanks to his connections in the city council and an urgent telegram to a Mr. Whitmore, the chief building surveyor, a roll of yellowed diagrams, was soon unfurled across our dining table. He traced a long, narrow corridor with his finger. "Here, a maintenance passage. It runs beneath the stage and connects to a hatch behind the orchestra pit. You believe someone could be lurking beneath the floorboards." Holmes tapped the page. "Not only that, I believe someone was. And more than once." He leaned back, eyes glinting. "Consider this, Watson. An actor hears a voice no one else can hear. Another is found dead in an alley. And now we have threats from the shadows. There's a pattern here, a deliberate orchestration. Someone is pulling the strings behind the velvet. Late that night, Holmes returned to the theater alone. I had offered to join, but he insisted he needed to move silently and unseen. He left dressed as a lamplighter and carried only a small lantern and a revolver tucked in his coat. I waited anxiously at Baker Street, the clock chiming midnight, then 1, then 2. At last, close to 3, the door creaked open and Holmes entered, his face pale, clothes dusted with soot. "I found it," he whispered. "A hollow under the stage. Narrow enough to crouch in, wide enough to move through. And Watson, there are scratches on the inside of the trapdoor. Someone has been entering and exiting at will. And the voice?" Holmes looked grim. "It's not a ghost, but a mechanism. A hidden funnel of tubing, connected from beneath the boards to the walls behind the curtains. One could whisper from below, and the sound would rise unnaturally, as if spoken from thin air. Brilliant," I breathed. "And terrifying," he nodded. "But that's not all. I found remnants of a torn script page. A specific scene. That was removed, altered." He held it up to the light. I leaned closer. "That's Miss Burnell's soliloquy. But it's written differently. Indeed. Someone rewrote her lines to include a hidden message. A name." Holmes folded the paper and turned to me, his voice low and certain. "We now know the message. What remains, Watson, is to discover for whom it was intended." Chapter: The Mark of the Minstrel. The morning sun filtered faintly through the heavy drapes of Baker Street, casting long golden slats across Holmes's cluttered sitting room. I was seated in my usual armchair, nursing a modest breakfast, while Holmes stood by the window, violin in hand, bow slack at his side. The instrument had remained untouched for some time, which was always a sign that my friend's mind was wholly consumed by a case. He had barely spoken since our return from the Pavilion Theater the night before. Instead, he'd busied himself with clippings, the theater program, and a tattered volume of opera lore from his personal archive. A heavy silence hung between us, occasionally punctuated by the rustling of newspaper or the scratch of his pen. As he added obscure annotations to his notebook, finally, Holmes spoke without turning. "Watson, you recall the fellow with the limp who stood in the wings last night?" "Indeed," the stagehand with the lantern. "Thin as a rake and pale as death." "Not a stagehand," Holmes corrected crisply. "A musician, or at least one who once was. His gait suggests injury to the left foot, consistent with an accident, possibly a fall from a ladder. But more intriguingly, his fingers bore calluses particular to string instruments. The right hand especially." I blinked. "You think he was a violinist?" "Not merely a violinist," Holmes replied, turning to face me now, his eyes gleaming with something close to triumph. "He was the former first violinist of the Regent's Minstrels, the very company that provided accompaniment for the old traveling operatic troupe once run by Madame Sorelli." The name rang a bell, and Holmes knew it. Yes, Watson. Madame Sorelli. The same woman who years ago was believed to have vanished mysteriously after her husband's sudden death in the countryside. Rumors swirled of affairs, debts, even occult entanglements. Her name has resurfaced only recently under the velvet pseudonym, the Lady of the Curtain. I set down my cup, jolted by the implication. "You mean to suggest she's the one behind the curtain voice?" Holmes merely inclined his head. "I have not confirmed it, but every whisper points in that direction. The tonal control, the mezzo register with Parisian training. It aligns perfectly, but I suspect she is not working alone." Just then, a knock at the door interrupted our thoughts. It was Mrs. Hudson, bearing a telegram on a silver tray. Holmes took it, his eyes scanning rapidly. Another note from Inspector Lestrade. He muttered, "They've just found something at the theater. Another body?" I asked grimly. "No, something more curious, still a trapdoor." By the time we reached the Pavilion Theater, The sun had climbed halfway up the London sky, and a small huddle of constables had cordoned off the wings of the stage. Lestrade, cap tilted at an angle, met us with a sour expression. "Just when I think I've seen everything, Holmes, your cases find a way to surprise me." He led us toward the back of the stage. Nestled between dusty rigging equipment and forgotten props was a trapdoor cleverly painted to blend with the wood grain. It had escaped casual inspection, but now lay open, revealing a narrow ladder descending into the darkness below. I had a man go down, Lestrade said. "It's dry and reinforced, leads to an old storm drain that connects to several older properties along Perdita Lane." Holmes peered into the hole, his eyes narrowing. "Which includes the former music academy, once owned by the Sorelli family," he murmured. He turned to Lestrade. "Was anything recovered from the passage?" Lestrade shook his head. "Only footprints in the dust one set. Small boots, likely female, recent." Holmes crouched, retrieving a scrap of paper from the trapdoor edge. It bore a musical notation, hastily scrawled. I leaned over his shoulder and read, "C, F, B, E." "It's not a melody," I observed. "No," Holmes agreed. "It's a code." Back at Baker Street, Holmes placed the scrap beneath a magnifier. 4 notes, each connected to a location on the chromatic scale, but they also correspond to letters via a musical cipher used in 19th century opera guilds. Sorelli, being trained in France, may have adopted this. He scribbled rapidly, translating. C becomes R, F remains F, B is L, and E. Curious, that's enharmonic to F, which gives us another ref. R. FLF, I said aloud. What could that possibly mean? "It may be initials," Holmes replied, "or it may point to something else entirely. But I wager the answer lies within the Sorelli Conservatoire, the music school. She once ran on Perdita Lane. If the tunnel beneath the stage connects to it, we must assume it still holds significance." That evening, beneath the veil of a particularly heavy London fog, Holmes and I set out on foot. Perdita Lane was a narrow crescent, long forgotten by all but the milkmen and chimney sweeps who serviced the derelict properties. We stood before the iron-wrought gate of the Sorelli Conservatoire, its windows dark and cracked, ivy crawling up, the sides like veins of an ancient corpse. Holmes produced a slim tool from his coat and worked the lock with expert precision. With a protesting creak, the gate yielded and we slipped inside. The interior was steeped in decay. Broken music stands littered the foyer, and the scent of mildew clung to every surface. Holmes led us deeper, passing the collapsed remains of a classroom and a hallway of framed portraits, until we came to what must have been the recital chamber. At the far end, beneath a tattered velvet curtain, sat a grand piano, its lid open, and on the music rest another scrap of notation. Holmes approached and examined it. "Different key this time," he said, "but a similar hand." Suddenly, a sound echoed from the floorboards above a low note, plucked as if from a stringed instrument. We froze. A second note followed, and then a disjointed phrase of melody played in eerie solitude. It was the same voice we'd heard from the theater ethereal, disembodied, sorrowful, but this time, it wasn't a voice at all. Holmes's eyes narrowed as he whispered, "It's not a person, Watson. It's a mechanical recording, an automaton, hidden in the rafters." I stared upward, and for a moment, the ceiling above shimmered with movement, metal gears turning, a shadow darting across the beams, and then it stopped. Silence. Holmes turned to me with sudden urgency. "We must leave, now. The trap was never meant to catch a criminal. It was meant to distract the hunter." Chapter 10. The Echo in the Walls. The cold air outside the Sorelli Conservatoire was a blessed relief after the stifling dread that had gripped us within. Holmes strode swiftly ahead, coat flaring behind him like the tail of some restless black bird, his jaw taut with thought. I followed close at his heels, trying not to glance back at the ancient building that still seemed to whisper even in silence. Not until we reached the broader thoroughfare did Holmes slow. Under the flickering glow of a gas lamp, he turned to me, his eyes sharp and focused once more. The automaton was programmed, he said in a low voice, not just to evoke fear, but to mislead. Whoever constructed it wished to preserve the illusion of a supernatural entity, the disembodied voice. You think it was a diversion? Undoubtedly. The true purpose of the conservatoire visit was to place the second scrap that coded notation. They anticipated we would follow the tunnel. They wanted us there. To distract us from what? Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he withdrew the second scrap from his pocket and, under the lamplight, aligned it with the first. The two torn edges matched neatly part of a larger page, clearly. The notation on the new piece read, A-D-G-E. His brow furrowed. The code continues. We now have 8 notes in total. A maps to S, D to A, G to N, and E. Perhaps M in the same cipher. Together, Watson, that gives us ARF, LFS, AN, M, an anagram. Possibly, Holmes muttered, or initials. But the key lies not only in the letters, but in the locations associated with each cipher. These aren't merely musical notes, they're markers. Droplets along a path, breadcrumbs leading to a destination. He hailed a cab, and we rode back toward Baker Street. Holmes sat in silence, fingers steepled beneath his chin, while the clatter of hooves and the hiss of wheels on cobblestones filled the otherwise quiet night. Once at home, Holmes unrolled a yellowing map of London and began marking locations: Pavilion Theatre, Perdita Lane, and now, a point south of Covent Garden. Each cipher note corresponds to a location where we've either found a clue or where Sorelli once lived or performed. But these are not scattered at random. They describe a spiral, Watson. A deliberate path curving inward. Inward toward what? Holmes tapped the center of the pattern, a forgotten square just off Ludgate Hill. Toward this. I peered at the name printed there, faded with age. Sanctum Mysterium. A private hall, Holmes said. Owned decades ago by an exclusive musical society, the Harmonic Fraternity. Many prominent performers and composers of the day were associated with it, including, I believe, Madame Sorelli's late husband, Anton Dupré. That name, wasn't he rumored to have died under suspicious circumstances? Indeed. Supposed fall from the bell tower of Ravensmoor Abbey, but no body was ever recovered. Only a bloodied coat and a cracked violin case. Holmes glanced up. And what's more, the harmonists were known for their experiments in auditory illusion hidden. Chambers, devices that mimicked sound from unseen corners, even early phonograph-like automata. If there is any place in London still steeped in their forgotten arts, it would be the Sanctum. He stood abruptly. We go there, tonight. The Sanctum Mysterium had not seen true activity in over 20 years. The facade was now a moldering shell, ivy-grown and soot-darkened, its windows shuttered or smashed. But Holmes's hand found the lock with ease, and the door groaned open to admit us into a hall thick with dust and silence. The main atrium was cathedral-like arched ceiling, acoustically resonant and lined with once elegant chairs, now collapsed or moth-eaten. Above, in the vaulted rafters, hung a complex chandelier of brass and glass strangely intact, its gears and weights visible even in the dim moonlight streaming through the high windows. It was once a marvel of engineering, Holmes whispered. Sorelli's husband, Dupré, is said to have designed it himself, part light fixture, part instrument. As if to confirm this, Holmes stepped carefully to the wall and turned the corroded handle of a mechanism. There was a soft click, followed by the faintest chime high and crystalline. From above, a single descending note echoed pure, harmonic. Then another, and another. Notes falling like tears down a forgotten stave. Holmes stepped into the center of the room, listening. They're not random, he murmured. They form a melody fragmented, but deliberate. A tune I've heard before. He spun toward me. Watson, the aria from Act 3 of La Fiamma di Sorelli, The Veil of Truth. Solo, I frowned. You mean the aria sung by the masked figure at the pavilion? Holmes nodded. But it gets stranger still, he said. That aria was composed after Dupre's supposed death, publicly attributed to an anonymous patron. But the composition style, the key signatures, it was his. Or hers. He climbed a dais at the far end of the hall. A grand lectern stood. There, its surface dusty but undisturbed. Upon it lay a book, leather-bound and clasped with tarnished brass. Holmes opened it with care. It was a ledger. Dates, names, coded entries. Pages of performances, private gatherings, and at the back a list of masks. Theatrical names, operatic aliases, each followed by a single Latin word. Velata, Bellator, Sapientia. And one at the very end. Curtana, the Lady of the Curtain. Holmes touched the name lightly, as if it might burn. She was one of them. Not merely a singer, but a founding member of the Harmonists. Her role in this is older than we thought. She never disappeared, she retreated, waited, and now, she returns. There was a noise from behind us. I turned swiftly, heart leaping. From a hidden corridor to the side of the dais emerged a tall figure in black, masked and silent. Holmes did not flinch. Miss Sorelli, I presume, he said evenly. The figure said nothing, but slowly raised a gloved hand and pointed upward to the ceiling. The chandelier mechanism had begun to move again, of its own accord. Holmes grabbed my arm. She's not alone. We've triggered something. A low hum vibrated through the floor. Gears shifted. Somewhere in the walls, a deeper resonance began to build, like a monstrous violin string being tuned. Holmes's voice was tight now. We need to get out. Now. This place is more than a concert hall, Watson. It's a machine. We fled the sanctum just as a sharp harmonic rang out behind us, shattering a pane of stained glass. Outside, the fog had thickened once more, swallowing the streets in gray silence. Beside me, Holmes was breathing hard, face drawn but eyes fierce. She is playing a game of shadows and sound, he muttered. But she's revealed her hand too soon, and now, Watson, now I begin to hear the truth between the notes.